When you go to the doctor for like a physical injury, there is this immense comfort in the machinery of it
Oh,
all.
definitely. You twist your ankle playing tennis, it swells up, and you just go in and they put you under an X-ray machine.
Right. It whirs, it clicks, and then the doctor puts this stark black and white image up on a screen, and there's this jagged white line on a bone. The doctor points to it and says, there is the break.
It is entirely unambiguous. I mean, you don't have to debate the philosophy of the ankle. You just look at the image.
Exactly. It's binary. It's broken or not broken.
Uh-huh.
But the moment you step out of that physical realm and into human argument, into debates about policy or philosophy, or even just an argument with your partner about whose turn it is to do the dishes, that X-ray machine just disappears.
It completely vanishes.
Yeah, and you are suddenly wandering through this swamp of emotions and cognitive biases, hidden assumptions, flawed reasoning. It is incredibly murky.
Which is exactly why humans have spent, the better part of 2.5 millennia trying to build an X-ray machine for the mind. We crave a way to strip away the emotion, the rhetoric, the beautiful poetry of an argument, and just look exclusively at the structural bones underneath.
To see if they are actually connected or if they are fractured.
Exactly.
And that is exactly what we are going to build today. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are taking a massive, custom-tailored journey through Mark Zigarelli's expansive guide to logic.
It's quite the journey, yeah.
It really is. We have a stack of notes, historical context, mathematical breakdowns, and our mission today is to shortcut you straight to the core of how human reasoning actually functions.
And we're leaving the dense academic jargon at the door, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you have ever felt overwhelmed by an argument and wish you had like a mathematical formula to prove exactly where the other person went wrong, you are in the right place.
Because at its core, logic is not some abstract, dusty academic exercise meant only for philosophers in tweed jackets. It is the underlying architecture of human thought.
The invisible scaffolding.
Yes, the invisible scaffolding. It's responsible for everything from the foundational debates of ancient Athens to the microprocessors inside the smartphone you are probably holding right now. It's holding up every scientific proof and every line of computer code that governs the modern world.
I really want to hang on to that phrase, the invisible scaffolding, because before we get to microprocessors and the complex math, we have to start at the absolute foundation. We have to define what logic actually is. And the text we are working from is aggressively strict about this.
Very strict.
Right. Logic, as a formal discipline, is exclusively the study of argument validity. It is not an arbiter of subjective truth.
And it is so vital to pause on that distinction because in our everyday lives, we conflate the two constantly.
Oh, all the time.
Yeah, if you're at a dinner party and someone says, the moon is made of green cheese, so we should launch mice into space to harvest it, someone else will inevitably roll their eyes and say, well, that's just illogical.
Right, because it sounds crazy.
But from a strictly logical standpoint, illogical is the wrong criticism. The formal study of logic does not care if the facts of your argument are true in the real world. It doesn't care about the green cheese.
It only cares about the structure.
Precisely. It evaluates whether your conclusion inevitably, inescapably follows from the premises you started with.
Okay, let me try out an analogy here, because when I was reading through the source material, I kept picturing like an industrial high-end meat grinder.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so the machine itself is the logic. The grinder does not have a taste palette. It does not care what you feed into the hopper at the top. You could put in a beautiful prime cut of Wagyu beef, or you could put in an old muddy leather shoe.
It's going to grind it either way.
Exactly. The grinder's job isn't to judge the ingredients. Its job is just to run the mechanical gears perfectly and grind whatever you gave it. The ingredients are your premises, the facts or assumptions you start with, and the grinding mechanism itself, the gears turning, is the validity.
That's a great way to look at it.
Logic doesn't tell you if the ingredients are good. It just tells you what the output must be if you accept what was put into the hopper.
I really like the mechanical nature of that analogy. It gets right to the heart of why separating validity from real-world soundness gives logic its immense power. In logic, we have a specific term, a sound argument.
Okay.
A sound argument is one where the structure is completely valid and the premises happen to be factually true in the real world.
That's the Wagyu beef going into a perfectly functioning grinder.
Yes, you get a perfect result. But by isolating just the validity, just the gears of the grinder, we gain a superpower.
Because we can test the machine without caring about the meat?
Precisely. What's fascinating here is that we can evaluate the structure of an argument
Uh-huh.
without getting bogged down by our emotional attachments or our personal biases about the topic itself.
Which is huge for, like, politics or ethics.
Exactly. Think about highly charged, controversial topics. People get so heated about the premises that they stop listening. But if you apply formal logic, you can step back and say, purely mathematically, look, let's just assume for a moment that your premise A and your premise B are true. Does your conclusion C actually follow from them?
And a lot of the time, it doesn't.
Right. Often, you find that even if you grant someone their starting facts, their internal machinery is broken. The conclusion doesn't actually follow.
So to understand the machinery, we have to look at the bedrock it sits on. The text highlights 3 foundational laws of thought.
Yes, these were formalized by the philosopher Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century, but he was drawing directly from Aristotle.
And when you first read these 3 laws, they sound so incredibly basic, almost, I don't know, juvenile, that you wonder why brilliant philosophers bothered to write them down.
They do sound simplistic at first glance, but they are the absolute minimum requirements for a rational universe. Without them, language and mathematics instantly dissolve into chaos.
Okay, so lay them on us.
So the first is the law of identity. This simply states that every individual thing is identical to itself. The classic formulation is A is A. Susan Sarandon is Susan Sarandon. The Washington Monument is the Washington Monument.
Right. It feels like a massive, well, obviously moment. I am me, you are you, a tree is a tree. Why is that a literal law?
Because in the middle of a complex argument, concepts have a tendency to drift. People use a word in premise 1, and by the time they get to their conclusion, they are using that exact same word to mean something slightly different.
Oh, I see.
The law of identity is a strict contractual agreement. It says that if we assign a concept to the letter A, it must remain exactly that concept, entirely consistent with itself throughout the entire logical operation. If A starts drifting, the gears in your meat grinder jam.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's about maintaining strict definitions.
Exactly.
So the second law is the law of the excluded middle, and this one states that every single statement is either completely true or completely false. There is no middle ground. There is no sort of true or mostly false. If I make the statement, I am wearing a blue shirt, that statement is purely true or purely false.
And in classical logic, there are absolutely no shades of gray. This is often where human beings start to chafe against formal logic, because, human experience is entirely made of gray areas.
Right. The real world is messy.
But remember, we are building a mathematical framework. If we allow maybe into the gears, we can't calculate a definitive result. A statement must resolve to a 1 or a 0, true or false.
Which naturally leads right into the third law, the law of non-contradiction. A statement and its exact opposite cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense.
Yes.
Like, it cannot be true that I'm wearing a blue shirt and be true that I'm not wearing a blue shirt.
Right. These 3 laws, identity, excluded middle, non-contradiction, give us the fixed rules of the board game. You literally cannot play the game of classical logic unless you agree to these 3 axioms.
You have to buy into the system.
Once you accept them, you have a foundation. You can start generating premises, you can start building intermediate steps, and you can arrive at a conclusion that is structurally undeniable.
So we have the rules of the game. But how did humanity actually figure out how to play it? Because there is a massive evolutionary leap from philosophers debating in togas in the Mediterranean to the literal mathematics that allow my laptop to process information.
A huge leap, yeah.
We need to wind the clock back and look at the history of how this discipline evolved. We have to start with Aristotle.
We do. We are going back roughly 2,350 years to ancient Greece. Aristotle was essentially the first human being to recognize that the tool of reasoning could be isolated and studied as a subject all on its own, completely separate from whatever was being reasoned about.
That's a huge paradigm shift.
It really is.
Okay.
He assembled a series of 6 texts on logic, which were later grouped together under the title Organon.
And organon translates directly to instrument or tool, right?
Right. Yes. Aristotle didn't view logic as a branch of philosophy. He viewed it as the fundamental tool necessary to do philosophy or science or anything else. He invented what we now call syllogistic logic.
Okay, remind us what a syllogism is.
A syllogism is a specific argument structure where you have 2 premises that share a common term and they lead to a conclusion.
We should give the classic example that, like, everyone learns in high school, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
That is the quintessential syllogism. The premises fit together so perfectly that if you accept that all men are mortal and you accept that Socrates is a man, your brain is forced mechanically to accept the conclusion.
But Aristotle didn't just stop at giving examples. He wanted to map the entire landscape of how statements relate to one another. The text details this brilliant matrix he created called the square of oppositions.
It's a really elegant system.
Yeah, he realized that you could categorize statements by quantity, meaning are we talking about all of a group or just some of a group, and by quality, meaning is it a positive statement or a negative statement.
And by crossing those two categories, he ended up with 4 distinct types of statements, which he arranged at the 4 corners of a square.
Okay, let's actually walk through this square, because visualizing it makes you realize how rigid language can be. The text uses an example involving cats, which I think is a much better way to learn this than using ancient Greek names.
Absolutely.
Let's start at the top left corner of the square. You have your universal positive statements. All cats are sleeping. It applies to the entire group, and it's asserting something positive. Every single cat in existence is currently asleep.
Now move across the top of the square to the top right corner. Here you have the universal negative. No cats are sleeping. Again, it applies to the entire group, but it asserts a negative.
So those are the universals at the top. At the bottom left, we have the particular positive. Some cats are sleeping. It's positive, but it only applies to a portion of the group.
Right.
And finally, bottom right, the particular negative. Some cats are not sleeping.
What made Aristotle's square so revolutionary wasn't just the categorization. It was how he mapped the internal tensions, the logical relationships between these corners. Specifically, look at the diagonals. Look at the relationship between the top left, all cats are sleeping, and the bottom right, some cats are not sleeping.
They are complete contradictions. Like, if it is true that all cats are sleeping, then it mathematically must be false that some cats are not sleeping. One instantly destroys the other.
Exactly. And the same is true for the other diagonal. If no cats are sleeping, then it must be false that some cats are sleeping. By plotting these relationships, Aristotle created the first formal system to verify consistency.
Which is incredibly practical.
Oh, very. If someone in a debate claimed that all politicians were corrupt, but later admitted that a specific politician was honest, Aristotle's square instantly proved they had contradicted themselves.
And this system was so effective that for hundreds of years, logic just stopped evolving. It took a massive multi-century vacation. People just assumed Aristotle had basically finished the job.
It was the gold standard throughout the Middle Ages. It wasn't until the 17th century, the era of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, that someone looked at logic and said, we need to push this further.
And that someone was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz.
Yes, Leibniz.
He is a fascinating figure. He's this brilliant polymath looking around at the 17th century, which was a very messy time. You had endless religious wars, massive political upheavals, intense philosophical disputes. And human language was just failing to resolve anything because it was so open to interpretation.
Right, people were talking past each other.
And Leibniz had this beautiful, almost utopian dream. He famously said, calculimus, which translates to, let us calculate.
He wanted to take the ambiguity out of human discourse. When mathematicians argue over a problem, they don't fight wars over it. They sit down with a slate, they follow the rules of arithmetic, and they find the error. Someone forgot to carry a 1 or misplaced a decimal point.
It's objective.
Exactly. Leibniz wanted to create a universal, formal language of reasoning where philosophers or politicians could sit down at a table, translate their arguments into a mathematical calculus, and literally calculate who was right.
It's an incredible vision, but to do that, you have to somehow transmute human language, which is messy and poetic and vague, into cold, hard numbers. And Leibniz couldn't quite get there.
No, he couldn't.
It took another 200 years to crack the code, which brings us to the 19th century and a self-taught mathematician named George Boole.
George Boole is one of the most consequential figures in human history, though his name isn't as widely known as Einstein or Newton. Boole looked at algebraic math, where you use letters like X and Y to represent numbers, and he realized that you could use that exact same structure to represent logic.
He creates Boolean algebra, and the genius of it is its extreme simplicity. Boole realized that when it comes to the structure of logic, you don't need the numbers 2 through 9, you don't need fractions or decimals, you only need 2 states, 1 and no.
Because logic, thanks to the law of the excluded middle, only cares if his statement is true or false. Boole assigned 1 to true and 0 to false. He entirely divorced mathematics from counting quantities of things.
Wow, so he wasn't adding one apple and one apple.
No, he was manipulating states of truth.
I was trying to visualize this when reading the sources. We often hear binary compared to, like, a light switch, but a light switch feels too simple to capture the complexity of an entire argument.
Sure.
I started thinking about it more like a massive plumbing system or a network of water pipes with valves. Imagine water is trying to flow from the start of an argument to the conclusion. A valve can only be fully open, which is a 1, allowing water to pass, or it can be completely shut, which is a 0, blocking the water.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, Boole figured out how to translate the concepts of A and D and or R into the physical arrangement of these valves. By arranging the valves in different sequences, you can build incredibly complex logical pathways using just those two states of open and closed. It's wild that he basically figured out how to turn human language into a circuit.
That valve analogy is deeply accurate, especially when you consider what happened a century later, because Boole's ones and nulls, his open and closed valves, are the exact mathematical foundation used to design electrical circuits.
Right.
When you build a computer chip, you are physically building Boole's algebra using microscopic electrical valves called transistors. But in the 19th century, this was purely theoretical math.
So Boole turns truth and falsehood into 1 and O. But we still need a way to connect these ideas into full sentences and arguments without relying on English grammar. This is where Gottlob Frege enters the picture.
Yes. In 1879, Frege published a work that revolutionized logic. He essentially invented formal symbolic logic. He said, let's strip away the nouns, the verbs, the adjectives. Let's get rid of the English language entirely and replace it with a formalized set of symbols that operate purely on mathematical rules.
And this was the birth of what we call sentential logic, or SL. All right, this is where we roll up our sleeves and learn the code. Sentential logic. If logic is a mathematical code, what does it actually look like on a piece of paper? In SL, the first thing you do is take a complete English sentence, a proposition, and you compress it down to a single constant, usually a capital letter.
For example, the sentence, Evelyn is going to the movies, becomes the letter E. The sentence, Peter is staying home, becomes the letter P.
And suddenly, the compound sentence, Evelyn is going to the movies and Peter is staying home, isn't a string of 12 words anymore. It's just E connected to P. We have removed all the linguistic ambiguity.
Right.
But to connect them, we need the plumbing. We need the valves. SL uses what are called logical operators. There are 5 main operators, and they are the engines that make the calculation work.
Let's break down how these operators function, because understanding them is the key to decoding any argument. The first operator is the simplest. It is negation.
The symbol for negation is a little squiggly line, a tilde. And all it does is flip the truth value to its exact opposite. It's like turning the valve from open to closed or closed to open.
Correct. If we define the constant L as the statement Leonardo DiCaprio won an Oscar, and we evaluate L as true, then the statement not L automatically evaluates to false. It simply reverses whatever state you are currently in.
Easy enough. The second operator is where things start connecting. It is conjunction, represented by an ampersand. This is the logical equivalent of the word A and D. The text uses a great, slightly absurd example to demonstrate how strict this operator is. The statement is, Albany is the capital of New York, and Joe Montana was a quarterback for the 49ers.
It's an absurd sentence because in standard English conversation, we expect the two halves of an A and D statement to be related.
Yeah, they have nothing to do with each other.
But sentential logic doesn't care about narrative cohesion. It only cares about the truth values. The rule for conjunction is incredibly strict. The entire compound statement is only true if both individual parts are true.
So Albany is the capital. That's a 1. Joe Montana was the quarterback. That's a 1. Because both are 1s, the whole statement is true.
Exactly.
But if I change it to Albany is the capital of New York and Joe Montana was a professional ballet dancer, the entire statement crashes to false. Even though the first half is perfectly true, the conjunction rule says a single false infects and destroys the whole thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, the third operator is disjunction, represented by a small lowercase v. This translates to the word OR.
Now, I have to stop here because this tripped me up when I was reviewing the material. In everyday English, or is almost always exclusive.
Right.
If I'm at a restaurant and the waiter says, your entree comes with a side of soup or a side salad, I understand inherently that I have to pick one. I can't have both. But the text is very clear that in logic, the V operator doesn't work like a restaurant menu.
It does not. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is a perfect example of why Leibniz wanted to calculate rather than converse.
Mm,
English is incredibly messy and full of implied double meanings.
yeah.
In sentential logic, the disjunction operator strips away the mess so we can calculate truth with absolute certainty. It is strictly inclusive. It means one or the other or both.
So, to use the restaurant analogy, if the menu is written in SL, I could order the soup and the statement is true. I could order the salad and the statement is true. Or I could be incredibly hungry, order both the soup and the salad, and the logical statement remains completely true.
Right.
The rule wasn't violated.
Precisely. The only way a disjunction evaluates to false is if both components are false. If you refuse the soup and refuse the salad, then the statement fails. Logic removes the social implication of the word OR and enforces a rigid mathematical definition.
I love that. A mathematically sanctioned excuse to order two sides. Okay, the fourth operator is the conditional. This is represented by an arrow pointing to the right. This is the if, then operator. If P, then Q.
The conditional is notoriously tricky for people learning logic for the first time because the way it evaluates to false feels counterintuitive until you really think about the mechanics.
Let me try to work through this because I definitely struggled with it. Let's say my statement is, if you mow my lawn, then I will pay you $20.
Okay. Mowing the lawn is the antecedent. The if part and paying $20 is the consequent, the then part.
So if you actually mow the lawn, which is true, and I actually pay you $20, true, the whole statement is obviously true. A promise was made and a promise was kept. And obviously, if you mow the lawn, true, but I refuse to pay you. False, the statement is false. I broke the rule. I lied.
Correct. But what happens if you don't mow the lawn? What if the if part is false?
Right. This is the weird part. If you don't mow the lawn, false, and I don't pay you, false. Logic dictates that the overall statement is true. And even weirder, if you don't mow the lawn, false, but I'm just feeling generous and decide to hand you $20 anyway, true. The statement is still logically true. How does false leading to true equal true?
Think of it in terms of breaking a contract. The conditional statement is only making a promise about what happens if the first condition is met. If you don't mow the lawn, the condition was never triggered.
Oh, I see.
I never made a promise about what I would do if you didn't mow the lawn. I could withhold my money, or I could give you free money. In neither case did I break my original rule. Therefore, the logical structure remains perfectly intact. A conditional is only false in one exact scenario, when the if is true, but the then is false. The promise must be triggered and then broken.
Ah, okay. Framing it as a broken contract makes it click perfectly. If the condition isn't met, the contract hasn't been breached, so it remains valid. That is a brilliant way to understand it.
It is entirely about structural integrity, not conversational expectation. Which brings us to the fifth and final operator, the biconditional.
The biconditional is represented by a double-headed arrow. It translates to the phrase if and only if. And the text uses an example for this that I don't think I will ever forget as long as I live. It is just such a wildly specific image.
It really is.
The statement is, a wig is hanging off of a bedpost in the guest room if and only if Aunt Doris is visiting.
It certainly paints a picture.
It really does. Let's assign W to the wig and D to Aunt Doris. W double arrow D. Mechanically, the double arrow means the two statements are inextricably bound to each other in both directions. The wig implies Aunt Doris. A-N-D, Aunt Doris implies the wig. They travel as a pair.
Correct. For a biconditional to be true, both sides must have the exact same truth value. If Aunt Doris is visiting, true, that wig better be on the bedpost, true. If it is, the statement is true.
And if the guest room is empty, no Doris, false, and no wig, false, the statement is also completely true because the rule holds.
Exactly. The statement only evaluates to false if there is a mismatch. If you walk in and see the wig, but Aunt Doris is nowhere to be found, the rule is broken. Or Doris is sitting in the kitchen, but the wig is missing, the rule is broken. They must match perfectly.
So we have our variables, and we have our 5 plumbing vowels: negation, conjunction, disjunction, conditional, and biconditional. When you put them all together, you have a complete, airtight language. You can take a dense, convoluted paragraph from a legal contract, strip away all the legalese, translate it into variables and operators, and you are left with a pure mathematical equation.
And once you have that equation, you need a way to solve it. You need a way to test if the argument actually works under pressure.
Which brings us to the ultimate stress test, the brute force method of logic, the truth table.
A truth table is exactly what it sounds like. It is a systematic grid where you map out every single possible combination of true and false for your variables, and you calculate the outcome for each row.
I think of a truth table like an engineering simulation for a new bridge. Here's where it gets really interesting. If you are an engineer designing a bridge, you don't just sketch it on paper, stand back, and say, yeah, looks
That
sturdy.
would be
Yeah,
disastrous.
right. You run it through a computer simulation that mathematically tests every conceivable scenario. You test what happens if a hurricane hits while bumper-to-bumper traffic is on the bridge. You test what happens if there's a minor earthquake while a freight train crosses. You test every permutation of wind, weight, and vibration to prove, mathematically, that the bridge will never collapse. That is what a truth table does for an argument.
It is exhaustive testing. If your argument only has two variables, say P and Q, your truth table only needs 4 rows to cover every combination. True, 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 false, false, true, false, false. But the size of the table grows exponentially.
How fast?
The formula is 2 to the power of n, where n is the number of variables. If your argument has 5 variables, you need a table with 32 rows to test every combination.
It gets massive very quickly. But when you run the whole simulation, your final column, the overall conclusion of your argument, is going to fall into one of 3 distinct categories.
The first category is called a tautology. This means that no matter what row you look at, no matter what combination of true and false you park into the variables, the final conclusion is always true.
It's an unbreakable bridge.
Yes. The simplest example is P or not P. It will rain today. Or RR, it will not rain today. If you build a truth table for that, it evaluates to true in every single universe. Now, tautologies don't give you any new, meaningful information about the world, telling me it will either rain or not. Rain doesn't help me decide if I need an umbrella, but they are structurally perfect.
The second category is the complete opposite. It's a contradiction. This is an argument that evaluates to false under every single possible interpretation. P and not P. It is raining today. A and D. It is not raining today.
That is a bridge that collapses under its own weight before a single car drives onto it. It is structurally impossible in this universe.
And the third category is where most of human communication lives. It's called contingent.
A contingent statement is one where the final column has a mix of truths and falses. Its truth is entirely dependent, contingent on the specific real-world values of the variables. If it rains, I will take an umbrella. That statement is true in some scenarios and false in others.
Now, drawing out a massive grid of 32 rows of T's and F's just to check a 5-variable argument sounds like a miserable way to spend an afternoon. So the text introduces a shortcut called the quick table method. And I thought this was such a clever hack. Instead of testing every single wind speed on the bridge, you act like a detective working backward from a crime scene.
You start with this strategic assumption. The most common way to use a quick table to test for validity is to try and prove the argument invalid.
Right, because for an argument to be formally valid, it must be impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false at the same time. So the detective says, let's assume a crime was committed. Let's assume the premises are true and the conclusion, IS, false. You forcefully plug a T under your premises and an F under your conclusion, and then you work backward, forcing the variables to fit that assumption.
Exactly. You reverse engineer the logic. If you can fill out the values for your variables without breaking any of the operator rules, then you have successfully found a scenario where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. You have proven the argument is invalid.
But if you are working backward, and you hit a mathematical wall, say, the rules force variable P to be true on the left side of the equation but false on the right side at the exact same time, you've hit a contradiction. The law of identity is broken. Your initial assumption was impossible. Therefore, the argument must be valid. It's so elegant. You avoid 31 rows of math by just looking for the one fatal flaw.
What is truly profound about truth tables and evaluation is how thoroughly they remove human bias from the equation. When you sit down with the truth table, you are no longer arguing opinions. You are proving semantic equivalence or contradiction with cold, hard facts. If someone disagrees with the result of a truth table, they aren't disagreeing with your opinion. They are forced to admit that they fundamentally reject the basic laws of rational thought. It ends the debate.
Okay, so sentential logic and truth tables are incredible tools. But here is the massive plot twist in the history of logic. As powerful as SL is, mathematicians eventually realized it has a glaring, massive blind spot because SL treats whole sentences as single, solid blocks.
Right, it doesn't look inside them.
Exactly. If I say, all humans are mortal, SL just calls that H. It's an impenetrable block. SL has no idea what a human is or what mortal means, it just sees the block. To get more precise, logic had to evolve again. It had to zoom in.
Sentential logic is a bit like looking at a dense forest from a commercial airliner at 30,000 feet. You can see the shape of the forest, you can see where it meets the river, you can map the macro structures, but you cannot see the individual trees, you can't see the leaves, and you certainly can't see the root systems. To truly model complex reality, and specifically to model complex mathematics, logicians had to invent a microscope. That microscope is quantifier logic, or QL.
My mind went to cars again. Imagine SL is looking at a car driving down the highway from a mile away. You know it's a car, you see it moving. But QL is like pulling the car into a garage, popping the hood, and examining the individual spark plugs, the pistons, the fuel injectors. QL allows us to look inside the sentence.
It breaks the sentence down into its atomic components. Instead of one capital letter for a whole proposition, QL separates the subject of the sentence from the predicate. It separates the thing from the property of the thing.
So instead of a giant block for Evelyn is tall, QL uses a lowercase e for Evelyn, an individual constant, and a capital T for the property of being tall. So TE means Evelyn has the property of tallness.
Yes, but where QL becomes a true superpower is in its name, the quantifiers. QL introduces two new, highly specialized mathematical symbols that allow us to talk about groups of things with absolute precision. The first is the universal quantifier, written as an upside-down letter A. This symbol translates to the phrase for all, or for every.
And the second is the existential quantifier, written as a backwards letter E. This translates to there exists at least one.
So let's go back to Aristotle's seeing. All cats are sleeping. In sentential logic, that's just a block. Let's call it C. But in quantifier logic, we pop the hood. We use the upside-down A. We say, for all things X, if X has the property of being a cat, then X has the property of sleeping.
We have translated a generic English statement into a precise mathematical formula. But when you start using phrases like, for all things, you immediately run into a problem. What do you mean by all things? And this introduces a concept in QL that I absolutely loved because it completely changes how a formula is written. It's called the domain of discourse.
The domain of discourse sets the boundaries of the universe you are currently operating in. It defines what the variable X is allowed to be.
The text has a great example of why this matters so much. Suppose my statement is, all of my children are honest. Now, if I set my domain of discourse to my children, meaning in this specific logic problem, the only things that exist in the entire universe are my literal offspring, then the QL translation is very simple. I use the universal quantifier. For all X, X is honest.
Because the only things X can possibly be are your children.
Exactly, but if we change the domain of discourse to unrestricted meaning, the universe now includes literally everything in existence, from my children to the coffee mug on my desk to the rings of Saturn. That simple translation fails. I can no longer just say, for all X, X is honest, because that would mean the coffee mug is honest and Saturn is honest.
So the formula has to adapt. It has to become conditional.
Right. It has to expand to, for all things in the universe X, if X has the property of being my child, then NX has the property of being honest. We've nested a conditional inside a universal quantifier. It is so deeply satisfying. It's like turning the dial on a microscope and suddenly seeing the cellular structure of an argument come into sharp focus.
And that level of focus is what finally allowed logic to fully model higher mathematics. Before QL, logic struggled to articulate complex relational ideas, especially concepts involving infinity. But with variables, properties, and quantifiers, mathematicians could suddenly express the infinite using finite symbols. They could write, purely in logic, for every number x, there exists a number y that is greater than x.
This was the breakthrough. With quantifier logic in their toolkit, mathematicians at the turn of the 20th century felt invincible. They felt like gods. They believed they had finally found the ultimate skeleton key to the universe. They honestly thought that with enough time and paper, they could systematically prove absolutely every truth in mathematics and science using pure logic.
It was an era of supreme intellectual hubris.
But they flew too close to the sun, and their wings melted. Which leads us into one of the most fascinating dramas in the history of science, when logic breaks. The era of paradoxes and the incompleteness theorem.
This period of history reads like an intellectual Greek tragedy. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this advanced logic was being heavily integrated with Georg Cantor's set theory. Set theory was a beautifully simple way to organize mathematical objects. A set is just a collection of distinct objects considered as an object in its own right. You can have a set of all even numbers. You can have a set of all the shoes in your closet.
It seemed like a flawless foundation. You organize everything into sets, and you use quantifier logic to manipulate them. What could go wrong?
What went wrong was Bertrand Russell. The same man who helped formalize the laws of thought was pushing set theory to its absolute limits, and he stumbled upon a fatal structural crack in the foundation. It is now known as Russell's paradox.
To understand why this paradox was so devastating, we have to look at the ancient precursor to it, the liar's paradox. The liar's paradox is famously simple. It is the sentence, "This statement is false."
Which is a semantic nightmare. If the statement is actually true, then what it says is accurate, which means it must be false. But if the statement is false, then its claim of being false is a lie, which means it must be true. It oscillates endlessly. It is an infinite logical loop.
Now, for a long time, mathematicians didn't care about the liar's paradox. They just brushed it off as a quirk of the English language. Oh, language is messy. Who cares? Math is pure. But Russell figured out a way to build the liar's paradox using the strict, rigorous rules of set theory. He essentially asked, does the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contain itself?
Let's translate that into the famous analogy that is often used to explain it, the barber paradox.
Yes, I love this one. Imagine a town with a very specific, strict rule. The town has only one barber, and the rule is the barber shaves all those and strictly only those who do not shave themselves.
It sounds like a perfectly reasonable rule for a set of people.
Until you ask the critical question, does the barber shave himself?
And the logic instantly collapses. If the barber does shave himself, then he violates the rule that he only shaves people who do not shave themselves. Therefore, he cannot shave himself.
But if he does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of people who do not shave themselves. And the rule dictates the barber must shave that group. Therefore, he must shave himself. He has to shave himself, which means he can't, which means he must.
Russell proved that this paradox wasn't just a quirk of language, it was a mathematical reality. You could construct a perfectly valid set using the accepted rules of logic that resulted in a universe-breaking contradiction. It sent shock waves through the mathematical community. The foundation they were building on was structurally unsound.
But they didn't just throw their hands up and quit, right? Russell, along with Alfred North Whitehead, spent years trying to patch the hole. They wrote this incredibly dense, multi-volume opus called the Principia Mathematica, trying to create new rules to prevent these self-referential loops. And their effort inspired another brilliant mathematician, David Hilbert, to launch what became known as the Hilbert program.
Hilbert was a towering figure, and his dream was the culmination of everything Leibniz and Boole had worked toward. Hilbert wanted to formalize all of mathematics into a single, perfectly consistent, and complete axiomatic system.
Complete and consistent, meaning he wanted a machine where every single true mathematical statement could eventually be proven by the rules, and absolutely no false statements or paradoxes could ever slip through. He wanted mathematical perfection.
It was a beautiful, noble dream. But in 1931, a 25-year-old mathematician named Kurt Gödel stepped up and delivered a fatal, inescapable blow to the Hilbert program. He published what is now universally known as Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Okay, we need to really slow down and unpack this because this was the most mind-bending thing I learned from the sources. I have heard of the incompleteness theorem before, but I never understood how Gödel actually broke math. How did he do it?
He did it by weaponizing math against itself. He realized that the symbols used in logic and math, the equal signs, the variables, the quantifiers, were just marks on a page. He wanted to force the math to talk about its own structure. To do this, he created a system of translation called Gödel numbers.
And this is where prime factorization comes in, right?
Exactly. Gödel assigned a unique numerical value to every single symbol in the formal logic system. The equal sign gets a number, the variable x gets a number, the open parenthesis gets a number, but he didn't just stop there. To translate an entire equation into a single unique number, he used prime numbers. You would take a sequence of prime numbers 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and raise them to the power of the symbol codes.
So if your equation is 3 symbols long, your Gödel number is 2 to the power of the first symbol's code times 3 to the power of the second symbol's code times 5 to the power of the third symbol's code. Because of the fundamental theorem of arithmetic, multiplying prime numbers like that generates a massive, completely unique number. It acts like an exact mathematical barcode.
Precisely. Every possible mathematical statement and every sequence of steps in a proof could now be expressed as a unique integer. He turned the formulas of mathematics into pure numerical data.
Which means math equations can now be plugged into other math equations.
Yes. Because the statements were now just numbers, he could write mathematical formulas about the statements. He was able to construct a staggeringly complex but perfectly valid mathematical formula whose Gödel number essentially translated to the sentence, This specific mathematical formula cannot be logically proven within this system.
Oh my God, it's brilliant. I described it in my notes as a computer virus. He essentially fed the ultimate perfect logic machine a paradoxical barcode that forced it to eat its own tail. He used the rigid rules of the system to create a mathematically valid statement that the system could not handle.
Right, because if the system can prove the statement, then the statement is false, since it claims it can't be proven, which means the system is inconsistent and broken. If the system cannot prove the statement, then the statement is mathematically true, but unprovable.
Which means the system is incomplete. It's a lose-lose scenario for the Hilbert program.
And this raises an important question, because the philosophical weight of this cannot be overstated. Gödel mathematically proved that any axiomatic system powerful enough to do basic arithmetic will always, inevitably, be incomplete. It will always contain mathematical truths that are entirely true, but which can never, ever be formally proven using the rules of that system.
He used math to prove that math has permanent, insurmountable limits. Mathematics is not a closed, perfect loop. There are things that are true that we can never prove. That is terrifying, but also incredibly humbling. It shattered the illusion that logic could be omnipotent.
So humanity was faced with a crossroads. If classical logic has fundamental limits, if the ultimate mathematical foundation has cracks in it, and we also know that the real world doesn't neatly fit into binary categories of pure true and false, how do we move forward?
We adapt. We bend the rules. Which brings us to the final evolution in our deep dive, non-classical logic and the computer age. If classical logic is rigid, non-classical logic says, let's break the oldest rule in the book. Let's break the law of the excluded middle.
The first major crack in the binary system came in the 1920s from a Polish logician named Jan Łukasiewicz. He looked at classical logic and did the unthinkable. He added a third value. Instead of just true, which is 1, and false, which is 0, he introduced 12.
And 12 stands for possible, which, when you first hear it, feels like cheating. You can't just introduce a maybe into math. But it's actually brilliant because it acknowledges the reality of time. Think about future events. If I say, it will rain tomorrow, that statement isn't true yet, and it isn't false yet. It exists in a state of possibility.
Łukasiewicz's three-valued logic opened the floodgates. Once you break the binary, you can introduce infinite gradations of truth. This evolved into what is now called fuzzy logic.
I absolutely love fuzzy logic. It replaces the on-off light switch with a smooth dimmer switch. It allows for degrees of truth. And the text gives a highly practical example of this involving politics, which is basically the kingdom of gray areas.
Walk us through the politician example, because it perfectly illustrates why binary logic fails in human negotiation.
Okay, so you have a politician trying to pass a land use bill, and she needs the votes of two local leaders, Rita and Jorge. They both want money allocated for a new school playground. Rita is pragmatic. She wants a modest budget, let's say $5,000. Jorge is ambitious. He wants a massive budget, around $25,000. In classical, strict binary logic, the politician is trapped.
Right, because she has to pick.
Exactly. If she offers exactly $5,000, Rita is 100% satisfied, so true, but Jorge is 0% satisfied, a false, so he votes no. The bill fails. If she offers $25,000, Jorge is a 1, but Rita thinks it's irresponsible, so she's a 0. The bill fails.
Classical logic forces an impossible either-or choice.
But fuzzy logic allows a politician to map out degrees of satisfaction on a curve. She can look for the intersection of their fuzzy demands. If she proposes a budget of $15,000, maybe Rita is 60% satisfied, so 0.6, and Jorge is 60% satisfied, another 0.6. By finding that intersecting degree of truth, she satisfies both of them just enough to secure their votes and pass the bill. It maps reality, compromise, and partial truths.
And fuzzy logic isn't just for politicians negotiating budgets. It is deeply embedded in modern technology.
Yeah.
If you have a smart thermostat in your house, it doesn't use classical logic. A classical thermostat just says, if temperature is below 70, turn heater to 100% capacity. If above 70, turn heater to 0%. It blasts hot air, shuts off, blasts hot air.
Which is super inefficient.
Right. A fuzzy logic thermostat calculates degrees of coldness. As the room gets closer to the target temperature, it gently eases the heater down to 20%, then 10%, maintaining a perfect balance.
It's a logic that actually mirrors how the world works. And the logicians didn't stop there. The source material touches on a bunch of these expanded logics. There is modal logic, which introduces specific operators to deal with necessity versus possibility. But the one that really melted my brain was quantum logic.
Quantum logic is where the universe literally forces us to abandon classical reasoning. At the macroscopic level, the laws of physics and the laws of classical logic hold up. But when you shrink down to the subatomic level, things change.
The text explains this using the classic P under the shell con game. Let's talk about this because it proves that at the fundamental level of reality, the law of the excluded middle is false.
Imagine a street magician with two shells, a left shell and a right shell and a P. In classical everyday logic, if he hides the P, the statement, the P is under the left shell or R, the P is under the right shell is true. It is a tautology. And crucially, it remains true whether you are looking at the shells or not. The P has a definite location.
Right. But in quantum mechanics, particles like electrons don't behave like Ps. They exist in a state called superposition. They act as waves of probability. Until you lift a shell, until you physically measure or observe the particle, it does not have a defined location. It is quite literally under both shells and neither shell simultaneously.
Which means the classical statement, the particle is left
Hmm.
or the particle is right, is meaningless before observation. The OR operator breaks down. Quantum logic had to be developed specifically to model a reality where the mathematical rules of truth change based on the act of measurement.
It is so wild to think that Aristotle's logic, which seemed like universal law, gets completely subverted by atoms. So we've traveled from Aristotle in a toga, mapping out sleeping cats on a square, to quantum physics where reality itself is fuzzy. So what does this all mean for us today? How does all of this abstract math actually build the modern world?
It all converges in the mid-20th century with a British mathematician named Alan Turing. Turing realized that everything we've talked about, Boole's ones and Ds, Frege's operators, truth tables, didn't have to exist just on paper. You could physically build them.
This is the leap from theory to hardware.
Yes, Turing conceptualized the Turing machine, proving that any logical algorithm could be executed mechanically. And engineers soon realized that they could use electrical currents to build literal physical logic gates based on the 5 operators we discussed earlier.
Let's actually explain how that works because it bridges the gap perfectly.
No.
How do you physically build an AND gate, a conjunction using electricity?
You use transistors, which, as we mentioned earlier with Boole, act like valves. If you wire 2 transistors in a straight line, in series, the electricity has to pass through the first one, and D then pass through the second one to reach the output. If the first valve is closed, a 0, the current stops. If the second valve is closed, a 0, the current stops. Both valves must be open, one A and D1, for the electricity to flow. You have physically built a conjunction operator.
And if you wire the 2 transistors in parallel, where the electricity comes to a fork in the road and can take either the left path or the right path, you've built an OR gate, a disjunction. The electricity will reach the end if the left path is open or the right path is open, or both.
Exactly. When you take billions of these microscopic physical logic gates and layer them on top of each other on a silicon chip, you have a microprocessor. The phone in your pocket, the algorithms feeding your social media, the operating systems running global financial markets. They don't just use logic. They literally are logic. They are physical manifestations of George Boole's algebra and Gottlob Frege's sentential operators, operating billions of truth tables every second.
They are the culmination of a 2,350-year quest to understand the architecture of thought. It is staggering when you put it all together like that.
It really is.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. We started this deep dive looking for an X-ray machine for the human mind. We wanted a way to cut through the messy, emotional swamp of human argument. And what we found in this comprehensive guide is that logic isn't just some rigid, dusty rulebook from antiquity. It is a living, evolving language.
It started as a way to win debates in the markets of Athens, became a mathematical code to escape the ambiguity of English, mapped infinity, proved its own limitations, and gave birth to artificial intelligence.
It is the ultimate story of humanity attempting to map the very boundaries of reason. And honestly, it leaves us with a rather profound, almost unsettling puzzle to consider.
I want to leave everyone listening with this to mull over. Think about the trajectory we just mapped. All of modern computer science, and by extension all of artificial intelligence, is built on the physical architecture of human mathematical logic. Billions of logic gates. But, as we learned, Kurt Gödel mathematically proved that human mathematical logic is inherently, permanently incomplete and limited. So what does that mean for artificial intelligence?
Oh, wow, that is a heavy question.
Can an artificial general intelligence ever truly understand the universe in its totality? Can it ever transcend the boundaries of human knowledge? Or is it permanently trapped, fenced in by the logical limitations and the fundamental incompleteness of the human blueprint it was built on?
Can the machine ever outgrow the flawed mathematics of its creator? That is a staggering question to end on. Well, thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the hidden machinery of thought. I hope that going forward, when you look at a political debate or a dense legal contract or even just the smart thermostat on your wall, you see the invisible scaffolding underneath. You see the variables, the operators, and the truth tables quietly running the world. We went looking for that clean, binary X-ray machine, and while we learned that even the X-ray machine has a few mathematical blind spots, it remains the most powerful tool humanity has ever built to see beneath the surface of reality. Keep questioning your premises, always test your validity, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.